This week, we talk with Murray Goldschmidt from Sense of Security. In the news segment, picture yourself in a threat model exercise. Developer training needs to modernize. A DevSecOps conference grows in size, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. False positives suck. With so many mobile apps to test, how much time will you waste on false positives? Eliminate them today with NowSecure. Only NowSecure automates static, dynamic, and interactive testing on real Android and iOS devices. Now you get speed, accuracy, and efficiency for DevOps, plus the broadest coverage of security, compliance, and privacy issues. Why waste time on false positives? Visit securityweekly.com/NowSecure to learn how to scale your mobile AppSec testing with NowSecure. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 71, recorded July 29th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Morning. Monday before Black Hat. Enough said.
Monday. Enough said, exactly. John Kinsella, I'm also here with you. How's your Monday before Black Hat?
The mosquito bites aren't too bad. I'm not sure if that's better or worse than, a week and a half from now at Black Hat. We'll see.
Sounds good. We have exciting news about the Security Weekly webcast program. We are now partnered with ISC Squared as an official CPE provider. If you attend any of our webcasts, you will be receiving 1 CPE credit per webcast. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Security Weekly is returning to Vegas this August for Black Hat and DEF CON. If you would like to request a briefing or sponsor an interview on site at Black Hat, please go to securityweekly.com/booking and submit your request. And submit it quickly because it is in fact next week, which gives us 1 week to cover the news before there's going to be all kinds of crazy news that comes out of Black Hat, won't there be? So guys, I wanted to start off with a bit of an old style attack, but use it as a departure point to talk about some of the themes we've been covering the last couple episodes. So the setup here is that some researchers were discovering some image files and were being loaded with their EXIF information. In other words, that text headers or the text preambles that go into a lot of image files was basically being loaded with some PHP code. And a PHP interpreter was actually reading the string out of that and executing it as if it were code. So now the attack here is actually kind of well known. It's happened at least within the last 5 to 10 years. It's also JPEGs, GIFs, images like this have been used for cross-site scripting attacks previously. But rather than dwell on the specifics of this particular attack, I wanted to throw it out there as sort of a threat modeling exercise in the sense of what would the cloud do differently here and what would sandboxing do differently here? The idea being, what if we didn't have a file system to have the first stage dropper drop some temporary files into? Or what if we had our VPCs set up to filter out egress filtering? So what do you think is sort of the better ways to prevent this type of attack?
That's better for you smart guys.
I'm always a fan of egress filtering. I think more people should do it. As I've said many times, I'm a fan of security in depth and layers of security. So I think those two things are nice sort of, preventative to make sure that, as you said, you're sort of sandboxing it. I'd really love to prefer to see, the input sanitization, easy for John to say, to happen properly in the first place. But especially in a larger org, or if you're using someone else's software, you don't always have that chance to have full control of the stack. So yeah, if you have, you work with what you got. If you've got control to on the network side to do the egress filtering, or to be able to some level of file system control, either only writing to temp or some sort of level of file system access around that, and that's where you've got the twiddly bits to be able to adjust. Yeah, do it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is sort of that idea of when you were talking about that input sanitization, and there's a lot of still application layer vulns that even with the sandboxing may not have taken, may not have addressed in this situation. So it especially is a problem of when we're talking about the sort of lift and shift approach to DevOps or to the cloud. You're just basically moving your problem into the cloud, and all of your application layer problems still exist. It's not until you start to embrace a lot of the cloud native capabilities rather than just moving into the cloud that you're probably going to be able to start mitigating a lot of these issues and having these types of scenarios be a lot less impactful.
But let's focus for a second around, really how you asked that question. I don't like your tone of no, but really come back and think about, look at this from a threat modeling point of view. And that's, with intent and with focus around what we were just talking about. Okay, yeah, we've had all these problems for years. We're moving to the cloud. Okay, well, what twiddly bits do we have that we can twiddle? Well, go be less file systemd type stuff, especially if you're in Lambda or something like that, depending on how you're doing this. And then, okay, well, we've got this API to control a firewall. We're deploying our code in an automated fashion. Maybe when we deploy the code, we can also deploy through Ansible or pick your poison, some way of actually locking down what the firewall should look like for my application. We know, I wrote the application. I know its use cases. I know it only needs to talk to a database. It never needs to talk to the internet. It's going to do a little bit of file processing that can happen over here in this location. So yeah, really, let's think about it from that point of view and really sort of focus down on looking at it like that. And I think both of developers and also the team around them, from management to operations to sec, dev, ops, all those guys, if you sit back and have that conversation, that's I think a really good thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I dug into this article a little more because I was like, well, how would you protect against it, right? And it's a typical attack, right? And one of the things we know is that when you launch malware, it tries to, maybe put itself on the file. It might run in memory, but in this case, let's say it's a file because it's an upload file. Well, can I prevent that file from uploading? Maybe using whitelists or something along those lines. Then you look at, okay, well, what's it trying to do? Oh, well, it's trying to spawn a shell. Well, can I stop that from actually happening? And in some cases, you can do that, right? And then it's trying to create an outbound connection to some known command and control. So if you start to think about the pieces of the attack, not only this attack, but other attacks that use a similar technique, you can start to think about layers of security that you can embed into your code or into your containers or into your different security components that would thwart aspects of this attack as it propagates.
Mm. And one more,
absolutely.
If I can add one more adjective in there, especially around some of the stuff we've talked about in recent weeks, how to do this easily. Right. So yeah, everything we're talking about, we could have done it back in our enterprise data center and, talked to SecOps and waited 2 weeks for him to modify a firewall and blah, 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 blah. But as we move from platform to platform, I think the key thing here when you're looking at that threat modeling is, yes, we've looked at these things before. Hopefully we've thought about how this application is going to be used. We're moving into this new, I won't use the buzzwords, we're moving into this new space. How can we use those particular knobs that we have here to do something interesting in an easy manner?
Yeah, how can we define really easy policies that we can enforce easily as code moves or is ported to different places, and not worry about maybe the technology behind it, but the components of how do I make that easy to define and then make that portable so regardless of where it runs, it still works. And sometimes we don't think about those basics, but simple don't allow certain files to be written, don't allow, your processes to fork or spawn shells, don't allow outbound communications that I don't know in my application should be there. Simple things like that. If you could put easy, simple rule enforcement around it and then let it go wherever the application runs, hallelujah. But I'm not quite sure we're there yet.
We definitely have the building blocks to it. So you can do, your S3 buckets for storage. So you don't need a file system for just dealing with, a single type of file like images. And, even serverless, AWS Lambda, something like that is going to make it a lot harder to fork off and have shells and, that nature of the attack, as well as we were even talking about there's a lot of syscall sandboxing we could even do here. So why is this, why is your PHP interpreter launching a shell? Or even after the fact, if you're at least logging it, if you're not preventing it, you can at least go back and say, oh, our PHP interpreter launched a shell. Why was that?
So a better question is, why are you using PHP in the first place? Just eliminate it.
Yeah.
It's got a bajillion vulnerabilities anyways, right?
But
Stop using it.
You know what's really funny about that? I've heard of two large, young, hip companies recently. Facebook's one, they're fairly well known. Another one's one of the chat apps, I think they're known too, they've got a PHP monolith on the back end. So that little cockroach ain't going away, but I know Facebook in particular does a bunch of stuff around how they use, and I think Slack does as well. But think about, it's using the tools you have. Maybe you don't need to use it. Maybe you don't need to learn a new language. If it suits your needs, okay, it's great for hacking and to get, something up and running quickly. I recently did a Google search thinking about security and PHP, and I wanted to go take a shower afterwards. So to each their own, but it's not going away anytime soon.
I know.
Yeah,
it's just if I had
struggle.
a choice and I'm developing an application, I'm probably not starting with PHP if I want a secure application.
And if you are, go with the, Facebook has their HHVM, which has a very nicely sandboxed, nicely constrained, a better security model than just the default PHP. As well as if you're going to start PHP, the modern versions, and this is actually maybe an interesting conversation for a future episode, it's like all these languages are also moving to stronger typing. Like we've talked about that with JavaScript. Even Python, new version of Python. Was it 3.8 has announcements, and they're just doing some more improvements just around the typing that they can support. So I think that's one of those things that the language has a bit of a legacy of problems that obviously makes it an easy one to come up with different things that poor PHP acronym can stand for. But rather than continue to pick on PHP, or maybe this is a decent segue as well, bug bounties for Google have been increased, and they have increased significantly. So what was the minimum baseline awards for Chrome OS and Android, coming up to $15,000, as well as getting onto a good exploit chain on a Chromebook? You can earn up to $150,000. So nothing to sniff at there, is there?
No.
No, and we saw some record payouts last year on aspects of this. Somebody asked me this a few years back on, what do you think about bug bounty programs, right? Are they good? Are they bad? Back then I thought that it was still a little but what do you guys think? I mean, are these programs good for our industry or not? I'm just curious your guys' thoughts on this one.
So my thoughts are, if some guy out there has spent his weekend or whatever, poking around something like this, it's nice to get the fame and notoriety. But I think when you're helping a really large company improve their security, it's only reasonable that you get something more in a t-shirt. So that's the way I look at it. The thought I've had in my head over the last few days, and I think one of the articles when this came out last week was saying, well, is this in a way sort of another form of an attack? It's almost like a monetary attack if you think about it. Because if I had, here, let me dream for a second. If I had a free weekend or a week where I could go and screw around with some of this stuff, am I going to go and poke around with the tiny startup that probably has more insecurities, but they might throw me a T-shirt, or am I going to go look at something that's a little bigger and I might get 50K out of it? So it's going to be interesting to see how that manipulates the focus on the application. It's sort of weighing it, right? I mean, that's a good thing. 150 grand, right? That's obviously it's not going to be easy to find something like that, but that gets your attention. But how much of the attention is that going to take away from either open source or from, like I said, the small guy that they care about their security as well?
So I definitely have a couple different perspectives I see this from. In the case of like Chrome, Chromebooks, Android, even over on the iOS side, and the what is it, the Pwn to Own that CanSec West runs. Those I think are all fantastic because those prices also reflect the maturity of the sandboxing, of the countermeasures, of the security models that these have built up. So I think there definitely is something to be said for encouraging that approach, that testing. When we switch over to web applications in general, I still do think it's important. But one of the things there's a couple of things where the model isn't quite so great. Because one thing could be, great, John, you just spent your weekend poking around, at some small website that maybe they do have a couple of vulnerabilities and a bug bounty program, but it's a bit of a race to be first because the way the bug bounty models are set up is that they reward the basically first blood. They don't reward the amount of effort that was put in. And they can also be a bit of a distraction because there is a lot of noise that comes in through bug bounties, and you have to deal with a lot of interesting personalities. Everything from, I will politely call a big bounty approach, where someone is just going in, hey, I found, your cookies are missing HTTP only on them. Or, look, you're getting a B- on your SSL lab score. Or your SSL lab score, you got an A+, but it says you have this weak cipher. In other words, there's this class of types of reports that are just low quality, no information, not even actionable, other than you've kind of filled up somebody's inbox with noise. On the other hand of the spectrum, there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of this kind of continuous testing. And we're going to get to this this item in a second, but I've also spoken about this at a couple different conferences. So this was one of the things about bug bounties, testing, pen testing. Where do you how do you approach them? How do you have one fit your maturity of your application? How do you have it so that you have a bug bounty that's really healthy, but then maybe your reports start to drop off? And in this case, you do something like attract more researchers and say both, we have, for something like Chromebook, we have something that we think is a pretty solid security model with sandboxing of processes. We have kernel hardening, et cetera. So we're going to reward even more money when you can find one of the implementation mistakes we have, or even better, find one of our design mistakes. We'll throw a lot of money your way. And that's going to a team of people that's likely been spending 3 to 6 months, if not a full year, working on this type of these types of exploits. So 150K hopefully is even profitable for them just on an hourly rate basis.
I'm curious the impact of this to the conference we're all going to be at next week in Black Hat, right? If you think about before bug bounty programs, a lot of this new kind of exploit research was coming out at an event like Black Hat. Do bug bounties actually now offset aspects of what can and can't come out at Black Hat next week? Because maybe it's already had to been disclosed if they want to get their bounty. Is part of that. Does that impact some of the other research that researchers are doing? I'm just curious because, look, that's where Black Hat made its name, was all this new research coming out on an annual basis. Do bug bounties actually potentially impact some of that research for Black Hat in the future?
Yeah, I think bounties, if anything, bounties are great because they're setting the tone that good faith actors doing security testing should be, at the very least, engaged by the security team and not by the legal team. And they, when they find legitimate vulnerabilities, be awarded for that work. I don't think it's actually going to impact the type of vulnerabilities and the type of security research that's coming to Black Hat, because on one hand, you can also just say, hey, I found this, but I'm actually not going to disclose it for a couple months until my Black Hat presentation. So there's still that alignment. Plus, two, I think there's been a lot of research that's more interesting than yet another cross-site scripting, yet another CSRF. This kind of the cruft that a lot of just like that long tail of bug bounties just gets paid out on. So I don't see it as a problem for pulling anything away from the timing of conferences, although your point is still made in the sense of how much is research being timed to go to conferences anyway. So, I have a big vulnerability that I discovered in January, but I want to sit on it for 6 or 8 months so I can take it to and make a big splash with at a conference.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking about. And I think if you tie that back with what you're saying before about first person who discovers gets the prize. I mean, yeah, it's I think those of us who speak at any type of conference, right? You have to start planning that stuff out months in ahead, especially if it's just a talk you're giving. Okay, you've got to hit your CFP, but if you actually need to do research for that, yeah, that's so I think in my head there's probably going to be a different category of person, or maybe even same person but slightly different focus. If I'm preparing for a talk or working on a hack for a talk, that's one thing, versus if I'm sort of, it's not quite drive-by, but I think it's a little more immediate, I think is the word I'd phrase, in actually going to look after a bug bounty.
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to add there too is that with like the pwn to own types of challenges and showing off, even DEF CON, Black Hat, when are there all these hacking challenges and people show up and then the headlines become, oh look, this pick if you want. Do you want Safari, Chrome, iOS, Android, whatever? Device X, software X was exploited within 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. That's a bit misleading because that 30 seconds was actually a well-tuned, well-refined exploit chain that had been worked on likely by a team of 2 to 5 people over several months. So yeah. It's also kind of important. Let's also kind of nudge the media to reframe that to this away from the 30-second attack into the how much do they actually spend $300,000 of time and effort to get a $150,000 prize, that type of thing.
Yep.
And speaking of conferences, here's one that's actually near and dear to my heart. SNCC acquires DevSecCon. And DevSecCon is, I've actually spoken there at both their London and Singapore conferences, and I would use it as any excuse to go back to London. I love London quite a bit. And if you go to some of the archives there, you can actually see me talk about bug bounties and pen testing, as well as role-playing games more recently, because that's even more fun. But bringing this back about DevSecCon, Francois Reynaud, who has created the conference, he has created a great conference. And I think this is a great sign that the community can only grow and get better because of this. Because this conference, to me, had a good editorial slant and a good focus on the type of content that it was bringing, in the sense that Francois made one comment at one of his introductions to the conferences that he wanted to avoid that idea of here's yet another presentation about the doom and gloom, or everything sucks, or look how bad security is, and roll your eyes and then walk away. On the contrary, he was very focused on we knew 20 years ago that information security had challenges. The OWASP top 10 hasn't changed in 20 years significantly. Let's actually do something about it. And he was gathering presenters, got to talk about tools, talk about processes, to talk about people, and actually how those things could become better for DevOps teams, meaning how can developers actually write code securely rather than the idea that, or the stance that the security team always has to do that sigh and that ugh, oh, we have to go clean up on developers. So I liked it quite a bit just from that perspective he was taking of being collaborative and having basically DevOps and security need to work together if they're going to make any difference.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, we've seen the growth in different conferences, right? KubeCon has grown dramatically. I think DockerCon's actually kind of calmed down a little bit and maybe even faded a bit with some of the recent changes over there. We saw Container World, but they weren't large events, right? And my curiosity was, how much traction was DevSecCon getting before? Sounds like some good. But now it's part of a vendor. And the one thing with me with vendor conferences is if they don't keep the broad topics and they turn it into a vendor conference, it could get a little too narrow, where I think some of these conferences need to keep a much more open mind and more open to content and different perspectives instead of what a vendor may want to push. So we'll see how this evolution happens with them to see if this continues to grow.
Yeah, and that's always an important concern. And so hopefully, under the curation of Francois and Lisa, I think they can do a good job of keeping that community together. That still is a great point that you want to see it not become vendory, but become like it's serving developers. Here's developers' problems that they have. And rather than align onto a single tool or a single idea, let's align on what they're trying to do, which is actually build code. And even secondarily, just build code that runs well and just so happens to be secure by default because they have easy things in their cloud that they can do to sandbox their environment, keep processes from forking or logging when that happens, egress filtering, all these great easy things that you can drop into your CI/CD pipeline with the modern tools, tech stacks. I think this was also one of the things that's leads into an article and a presentation that'll be given at Black Hat next week about security training. And there's one of the quotes in here kind of definitely resonated to me is the idea that traditional developer training, if it's always and only just aligned with the OWASP top 10, and it's about here is a 60-minute, even 30-minute, even just 20-minute slideshow video presentation to sit and listen to, that hasn't gotten us anywhere, and I don't think it's getting us anywhere. And the sense of this article is more about let's be both relevant and entertaining, and maybe even add some gamification to this process. And I know there's vendors like Secure Code Warrior that are doing a great job of this. And here's another presentation Heisler from Hunter 2 to look for next week, just to see what could we be doing better, which I think is a long list, but how should we do that better? And let's actually look to see some positive ideas there to make training actually make a difference for once.
Yeah, the other line I like in here is deploying new code 5 times a day means you can't wait for annual training on outdated topics. So to your point, the OWASP top 10, it has its place, but it's also not the breadth of what needs to be done. But if you're only doing that once a year, think of all the changes that are happening throughout the year, and therefore your training programs have to change to keep up with the frequency of what, not only the change, but also how we're deploying code today.
Yeah, and it's also a behavior, there's behavioral ideas, educational ideas, because when you do something a little bit every day or even just, on a more frequent basis, it just reinforces a lot better. So the idea that set aside the OWASP top 10 for a second, but just be thinking about security, or just when we start off this segment about threat modeling, even just doing a threat modeling exercise once a month can be actually really good. Pick a vulnerability that is interesting. Pick a exploit that happens to one of your peers in the industry, or pick something from your own bug bounty program. Say, here is yet another boring cross-site scripting maybe, or much more commonly, here's a very complex authorization issue, or here's an interesting authentication, recovery workflow that has some interesting engineering trade-offs, and just have a curated discussion with the security team, leading that with developers, just to get their minds thinking about security. And I think that alone can be a great step towards having better culture of security within your DevOps teams.
Yeah. I want to, before we, go ahead, John.
I was just saying also, I think there's something to be said. Frequently, you don't even really have to really put a lot of effort into this, right? Effort helps if you effort helps. If you're doing something as you get more mature, you need to start thinking about, oh, okay, let's actually do training and do something really specific. But what I've seen, like, at Layered Insight when we're getting going, one of my developers over there, Yusuf, I don't know, doubt he probably watches this, but he was constantly asking, hey, can we do a hackathon? Can we just take like one day a quarter? And, we have some thoughts on how either there's some bugs in here, how we can fix some of these things or do things better. I think just by giving the team a chance to work on that type of thing, it improves morale. It improves, their interest. It allows them to feel more committed instead of just constant slave driving, which of course I never would do. But I think, you can do a lot of stuff at the basis without having to do more advanced. So, it's the advanced stuff is great, but listen to people and give them a chance. I think at the first place also for the managers out there is quite important.
Yeah, and especially when let them go forward with what they're interested in. Like maybe they need a little bit of nudge in one direction to be reminded about a security angle, or you can mention something like additional security aspect they weren't thinking of. But that's just a great point, especially if they're asking for it. Go forth and just let them do the work and do a lot of the discovery with some guidance to add some additional context and work out those threat models or those security interests. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and that ties into this last article I wanted to make sure we covered before we ran out of time. And that's the one around ephemeral certificates, because I have some questions on this one I want from you guys, right? I think the concept's interesting, but when you start thinking about just-in-time certificates that auto-expire, I start thinking about, okay, management of these types of certificates. I think there's some great pros to eliminating PAM solutions when it comes to providing access, which I think is great. But how easy or difficult is the management of these ephemeral certificates in your environment, and what happens when they expire? How do you renew them so your app doesn't break? Can you guys dig into this one a little bit with me? Because I'm curious on how this works.
So I'll dive into that first. So one is the aspect that I think fundamentally this is the smart way to go. This is the good way to go, because you're also getting into certs rather than passwords. You can have the certs tied to YubiKeys, for example, or hardware tokens for the passphrases for them. And you dove right into one of the challenges, though, that managing this at scale and making sure this does become the brittle part that actually causes an outage because nobody can reach production. So you caught me off guard with the sense of I just blanked out on some of the open source tooling around SSH CAs, SSH certificate authorities, that I believe Facebook has worked on and open sourced. I know Google has its own mechanism like this. And there are other companies, I think even Slack we mentioned earlier. I want to say they're one of the other companies too that are working on open sourcing their approach to managing these certificates. But it ties into something like Let's Encrypt as well with the Acme protocol that gives you these ability to manage all of these aspects of revocation, issuance, more importantly, and basically tying them into your huge PKI model for your infrastructure. It's by no means an easy lift. It takes a lot of work to get there, but the benefits are great. And there's a lot of prior work that, of course, right now I'm failing to mention the good URLs for, but I'll have to throw those into the show notes. But there's a lot of prior work actually you can build on that makes this feasible.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's better than username, passwords, and service accounts, and then putting them into a vault and all the complexity, right? Because one of the things, the nirvana behind DevSecOps is, ease, remove friction, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think PAM solutions do anything but overcomplicate things in some respects, especially when you're dealing with code. So I think this is a really great model, but as we were discussing, my concern is, how do you manage this at scale? Because how do you know when the certificate's expiring to know when to renew it? And if you don't, the app goes down, and then then all the issues come up. It gets really interesting fast.
So let me throw this in there as well, because I also want to just challenge the premise: why are you humans touching production systems anyway? A lot of this is we should be getting to the point where, like, SSH command line on a prod system, we don't need that anymore. We have a robust CI/CD pipeline. We have tooling that gets this all set up and automated anyway. We have robust logging that gets the information off of those production systems anyway. So if we're going to do this, I would also throw in there, once a human touches what should be an immutable system, then they get the information off, that system is destroyed and a new one rolled out. And you set that expectation that this should be actually few and far between for human access into those systems.
Yeah, well, that brings up a really great point, right? It can't be ephemeral if you're allowed to make modifications and create drift in production, because you'll never be able to just bring that device back up and have it work as it was deployed because you changed it in production.
Yeah, don't make authentication stronger and easier by making your life harder to operate it over time. That ops teams, yeah.
Got it.
I bet Paul's ears are burning somewhere, because those of us who have spent time in academia where you have all these servers you have to SSH into, you end up with just doing management on your SSH known hosts. Let's leave the rest of things out of this. So that was always my cohorts at the universities would always be like, that was a pain in the butt. Like, okay, is this host still there? No, we tore that down. New grad student, whatever. But as we move to cloud, you've got that ephemerality where, you use an EC2 instance to hack on something for 30 minutes and you toss it. After you do that 40, 50 times in a month, now you've got all these keys that, okay, well, was that a system I'm still accessing? Is that still around? So you're not even looking at the authentication side. It's just keeping track of your own, what's known to you on your own machine. So it's sort of surprising that I haven't looked into any of these tools you were talking about, Mike. I knew they were out there, but I've personally never used them. I think, yeah, in the vast majority of time, you shouldn't be connecting to these systems. I can't remember who. I know a few years ago, before the containery type thing, one of the larger, I don't think it was Netflix, somebody was actually disabling SSH on their EC2 instances. And that seemed sort of mind-blowing at the time, but now it's like, oh yeah, that sort of makes sense. So yeah, there's multiple ways to look at this. I think this is, I'd call this sort of legacy support, right? There's still a lot of use for ephemeral keys and short-term keys, either from a vault token point of view, as an example, or as we're talking about Acme and Let's Encrypt. But I don't want SSH to go away, but it shouldn't be getting used quite that heavily, in my opinion.
Well, speaking of SSH, I want to thank my two known hosts, Matt and John, for this segment. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to return with our interview with Murray Goldschmidt from Sense of Security.